with this Leading Tough Conversations. You were here last month for the communication strategies for managing change, so this is a nice compliment. And those of you who could not attend Lynn's presentation last month, it's available on the CE archives page. There's a recording there, and we are recording the session today. So thank you, Lynn, for allowing us to do that as well.
My pleasure.
And I'd say go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Okay, I think you need to pass.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to change the screen to you. There we go.
Okay. Right. So now you guys should see my screen, or my shiny smiling face.
Yes.
Thank you all for attending this afternoon. As Louise said, I'm Lynn Hoffman. I'm currently the Director of Operations at the Somerset County Library System in Bridgewater, New Jersey. But you may know me from my time in Railsland. I previously worked at the Naperville Public Library, so that's my connection back to Northern Illinois. And as Louise said, this is kind of a nice pairing with the webinar that we did last month. I am going to cover a little bit of some of the same content because I think it has bearing on this. So if you did happen to attend last month's webinar, please feel free to just kind of tune out and then come on back. We're back with new material. So the first thing that we're going to do actually is a poll question. So the question is, how confident are you in your facilitation skills? And I'm going to ask Louise to pull up a question so that you can answer it on your screen.
All right, I'm launching the poll now. And we'll give everyone a few seconds, maybe 20 seconds or so to vote. And then I'll show the results, and then I'll read them so you can hear, Lynn.
Excellent.
All right, about 70% have voted. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. All right, we're at 83%. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Terrific.
And share the results. All right. So the results are 9% said not confident at all, they need help. 22% say they are somewhat unconfident, that they muddle through. The majority say somewhat confident. 51% say they're somewhat confident and that they're okay leading a discussion. And 18% feel that they are rather confident and they're a good facilitator. And no one said extremely confident. So I'm glad you are leading the webinar today.
Yay! All right, excellent. Thank you all for participating. That kind of helps give me an idea of where everybody is. So as we move forward, I can help fill in some blanks in some places. Hopefully that'll help out. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is why tough conversations are tough. And it comes down to the fact that people who work in libraries are passionate about what we do. We're not in it for the money, clearly. So the things that we get out of working in libraries make us really passionate and fired up. And that means that high stakes emotions often tend to lie right under the surface. A lot of times, and this is true for me, my identity is wrapped up in being a librarian and a public servant and doing a good job. And so that means that when there are issues that kind of threaten that, it really itches right at the very heart of who I am and what I do. And that's true for a lot of people who work in public libraries. So when individual people or ideas are in any kind of conflict in a library setting, it's just amazingly easy for unintended words or actions to really strike at those emotions and unleash them and have it throw things all out of whack. So a tough conversation really isn't so much about the content, or at least facilitating it, it's really more about the emotion. Acknowledging and talking through strong feelings is a really important part of resolving conflict and facilitating those kinds of discussions. So this is the part where we're going to rehash a little bit what we talked about in last month's webinar. It's all about the brain. So this is kind of the shortened version of why dealing with emotional reactions really has to be the starting point before you can move on to content. It's all about the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of the hindbrain. It's the primitive part of the brain. It acts as your alarm system. So it takes in all the stimuli that are coming at you from outside in the world and makes a split-second decision about whether it's threatening or not. So sometimes you'll hear this discussed in terms of being fight or flight. So when it kicks the rest of your limbic system into gear to handle a threat, it uses up a lot of mental energy, which doesn't leave a lot left over for the prefrontal cortex or the executive function part of the brain to manage kind of rational, logical thought. Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, calls this the amygdala hijack, and it's like that piece just completely takes over any available brain function that you have, and you just don't have anything left in the tank to kind of think rationally or speak logically with people. The brain treats many social and emotional threats and rewards with the same intensity as physical threats and rewards. So if I feel emotionally threatened, my brain is going to fire up in exactly the same places and with the same intensity as if I'm physically threatened. It tends to become aroused or get kind of fired up in proportion to the strength of an emotional response. So the stronger my response is, the more energy that part of my brain is going to take up. And firing up in response to danger comes on faster and with a lot more intensity than firing up in response to a potential reward. So that's why it's really, really easy for someone to take that one thing that you say in a performance review that's negative and turn it into like a completely huge thing when the bulk of it was positive. That one negative thing is that threat, and it's much more powerful than the reward or the positive kind of stuff that comes their way. David Rock, who wrote a book called Your Brain at Work, also this article about a brain-based model for collaborating with and influencing others, which I think is awesome. He talks a lot about predicting where people's emotional trouble spots are going to be so that you can kind of manage them ahead of time or think through them ahead of time and be ready to deal with whatever those reactions are. So just to go over them quickly, he argues that there are kind of 5 major areas where people tend to run into trouble. First one is status. And that's where there are threats to your rank or your expertise or your experience. Next one is certainty, predictability, patterns, being able to understand what's coming next. Autonomy, that's a sense of agency or control, the ability to decide for yourself what's happening in your life and in your surroundings. Relatedness, that's the social one about belonging and acceptance. And then fairness, which is all about justice and transparency, knowing exactly why things are happening the way they are. So that's kind of the quick rundown on SCARF. So the capacity to make decisions, to solve problems, to collaborate with other people is generally reduced by a threat response and increased under a reward response. So most of us have one domain that's easier to trigger than others, both on the threat and the reward side. So your brain is trying to get toward things that reward in whatever the trigger areas are for you, but much, much more importantly, it's trying to stay away from things that threaten whatever that trigger thing is for you: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Most of us have one domain that's easier to trigger than the others. For me, I don't know, it kind of depends. Sometimes it's fairness. If things don't feel fair, like that kind of flips me out. I also really am keen on autonomy. I like to know kind of that I get to choose what's happening. So when things threaten me in those areas, that's when I'm much more likely to react with strong emotion than in some of the other areas. Now, that isn't to say that a particular tough conversation might not prompt a threat response in a domain where you're usually just fine, but there's usually one that's particularly sensitive for you. And we talked about this a little bit more in that last webinar. So for tough conversations, And when we talk about tough conversations, we're talking about discussions where a strong emotional reaction or a threat in one of these areas has the potential to derail the progress of that conversation. The key to success in those situations is crafting a structure that'll help people get through those inevitable reactions so that they can move on to the content of your discussion. So that's kind of the foundational science underneath kind of what we're going to talk about. We're going to do another quick poll. So Louise, if you could pull the actual poll screen up. If you've ever participated in a discussion that you thought was facilitated particularly well, what would you say made it successful? And I've given you 4 choices plus I've never been part of a well-facilitated discussion. You may have other things that stand out immediately in your mind, and if you want to stick those in your question box, Louise can share those with us.
Sure. Yep, the poll is launched, and people are reading through and clicking the answers, so give it a few more seconds. Might need a little extra time on this one.
Some longer responses there.
Yeah. So we're at about 60% voted. All right. Give it a couple more seconds. Almost done. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We're at about 80%.
Great.
And I'll share the results. All right. So with these results, about 12% said the facilitator had a lot of experience with the topic at hand. 43% that said that everyone could participate and share their point of view. 39% said the facilitator was adept at handling interpersonal conflict. And 4% said we were able to come to a unanimous decision. And then only 2% said that they've never been part of a well-facilitated discussion.
Okay. All right. So hopefully, as we move forward and talk about specific facilitation approaches and tools, you'll start to maybe get a better picture of why it is that you haven't had the experience of a well-facilitated discussion. There are some factors that are more critical than others in really getting a good facilitated discussion going and having it be productive for everybody involved. And the 2 factors that were voted for most are 2 of the strongest ones. So we'll talk first about what facilitation is, and then we'll go into more specific techniques and skills. So first off, yes. Oh, yeah.
Before you move forward, we did get a few comments. Did you want to hear those now, or did you want to wait? Okay.
Yes, thanks for interrupting.
Oh, sure. So the first person who commented said that that's a tongue twister. The facilitator managed the discussion so that everyone could participate.
Mm-hmm.
The next person commented that we agreed that it was good that everyone could participate, but we think it's important that everyone in the discussion agreed that the facilitator would settle disagreements and have the final say.
Yep.
And then the last comment was a well-facilitated discussion. In a well-facilitated discussion, everyone feels safe.
Yes. I concur with all of those things, and I'll touch on them more a little bit as we go forward.
Okay.
So you've had some good models for facilitation, and that's fantastic. I have to say, facilitation is one of those things that if you can watch someone who's really good at it, do it, that's as great a learning experience as sitting through a webinar. So if not better. So if you know someone who's a really good facilitator, you might try to piggyback on one of their meetings or jobs or whatever. So at any rate, back to what facilitation is. There are kind of 3 main criteria that are important, I think, in our setting in libraries. The first one is that facilitation is activity-based. And activities are what provide the structure that make people feel safe in risky situations. And a situation may not feel risky to you or to everyone in the room, but again, if it's threatening any of those kind of touch points, or if it threatens to kind of reveal some of that really high stakes emotion that's right under the surface, that is an inherently unsafe feeling situation. One of my favorite books on the subject is
Lynn, I think I lost your audio. Are you still with us? Okay, I think we lost Lynn's audio. This is Louise. Can people hear me okay? All right, so we can hear me. Let's see what happened with Lynn. Okay, sorry about that. Let's see what happens with Lynn. Lynn, are you still with us? I'm going to try and chat with her. You're back.
Oh, I lost.
We lost you, Lynn.
Oh no! Oh no! Okay.
Okay.
Let me back up. Where we talked about activities. We talked about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think right where your slide is, you're on respectful of different modes.
Okay.
I think.
I will back up to that. My apologies. Facilitation is respectful of different modes of participation. Another really important thing in libraries, particularly because we have a large proportion of introverts among our coworkers and colleagues. I mean, this is intuitive stuff, but it's important to be deliberate about it as you're kind of planning your approach to facilitation. So we know that some people are very verbally expressive off the cuff. They don't need much think time at all. Other people really need that time to think through and gather their thoughts before they're ready to share what they've kind of pulled together. In some cases, people will talk in front of anybody who's in the room. Some other people might be really cognizant or have a heightened awareness of any sort of power differentials that are in the room, and that might make them more reticent to speak up. So as you're planning your activities, you're going to come up with a combination of methods that addresses those different modes of participation, and we'll get to what some of those possibilities are in just a little bit. The final thing is that facilitation is directed but not directly persuasive. So that means that you can know what you want people to come away with. You can have an end result in mind, but you really have to let people get there on their own. And if they're not getting there, that's a hint that you might need to rethink the end result that you had in mind. Now, I want to take kind of a side conversation here and talk a little bit about kind of textbookish definitions of facilitation. The Association for Training and it used to be the Association for Training and Development, now it's the Association for Talent Development. It's kind of the national organization for people who do training and staff development. They have a great kind of overview of facilitation, and one of the things that they talk about is that in a kind of properly, a facilitator has no vested interest in the outcome of the discussion that they're facilitating, which can be really hard in the library setting. So I'm just going to run through quickly their roles of a facilitator. We're just going to talk through this real quick, although I am going to take kind of a side note. I noticed Louise just said the audio cut out when I was going to mention one of my favorite books on the subject. It's Crucial Accountability, Tools for Resolving Violated Expectations, Broken Commitments, and Bad Behavior. It's actually in the resource handout and on the last slide too. So if you missed that, just hang on till the end and you'll get the citation there. Okay, roles of a facilitator. So the first one is managing the process, and we hit on some of these things already, making sure that everyone has a chance to participate, keeping things on task, providing structure, controlling the flow of contributions is a really important piece of facilitation, and I've got some great suggestions for that coming up. acting as a resource, that's advising on problem-solving methods, protecting group members from personal attacks, that's a really important one, trying to keep the discussion civil, and again, I've got some suggestions for how to do that. The more tricky one is remaining neutral. ASTD or ATD really says staying emotionally uninvolved, keeping out of the spotlight, becoming invisible when the group is facilitating itself, and keeping silent on content issues are important parts of remaining neutral for a facilitator. And that's all true. Facilitation really does work best when the facilitator is truly neutral, which is all well and good. But most of us don't have the budgets to bring in outside facilitators unless it's a really big project like strategic planning. We might have a facilitator for those kinds of conversations. But if it's just a run-of-the-mill, we've got some stuff that we need to put out on the table and pick apart and deal with, that isn't something that we're going to be able usually to bring in an outside facilitator for. So a lot of times it's us who are in that role of facilitation, and there are a couple different strategies that you can use to kind of balance the fact that it's hard to stay neutral with how to keep the conversation moving forward. So the first one is about remaining neutral and staying emotionally uninvolved. So we talked a little bit, so I love this picture. This is from this scrapbook from the 20s, this actress who's showing all these different emotions. It's fabulous. At any rate, we talked a little bit about how emotional reactions overwhelm your brain's ability to think critically and logically about something. And that applies to you as well as the facilitator. If you are caught off guard by your own emotional reaction to what someone has to say or how the conversation is going, that's going to get in your way of managing the rest of the conversation. And the strategy that I like to use to get around that is something that I don't know that I've seen it called this anywhere, but I've coined the phrase emotional rehearsal. So it works like this. You think about the conversation that you're going to have. You think about what kinds of reactions people are going to have in that conversation, and you imagine what your own emotional response to that is going to be. It's kind of like visualizing in sports. You know, you're going to visualize yourself sprinting through the finish line, and that helps you kind of cement that in your head. It works for emotions as well. So here's an example just to kind of try to clarify this. Let's say there's a discussion going on, and in the interest of making things work better, you're asked to share an example of a time when a coworker's approach maybe didn't work as well as it should have. You know, we've talked generally about this, but we need to get into specifics if we're going to be able to do anything about it. So you're being asked to share specific times when something didn't work as well as it could have. There's a bunch of different things that could happen when you share that example. Here are just a few examples. One is the person in question could get defensive, or they could deflect and try to push the reason that that happened that way was somebody else's fault, or it wasn't up to me, or you know, this other person does this all the time. So that defensiveness, for me, my emotional reaction to that is frustration, that the person isn't hearing what I have to say. So what does that frustration feel like? Sit with it, think for a second. I've experienced sort of before the moment what that level of frustration feels like. I can set that aside, and if that's what comes back to me in that conversation, I'm somewhat prepared for it. Another possible reaction to that is the other person might just start crying. They might break down. So my emotional response to that usually is empathy for that breakdown. So what does it feel like to observe someone else who's going through that process, and sit with that feeling and that response for a little bit and kind of understand what it is and what it feels like, and then move that on. Another reaction that you might get, silent treatment. Silent treatment makes me angry, like the whole arms crossed, whatever, I'm not talking to you about this, I've disengaged from the conversation, it makes me absolutely nuts. So what does that anger look like and feel like? And let me kind of figure out what that is, so that if that's what arises in the moment, I've already kind of had that emotional rehearsal and can set it aside and move forward. Hopefully that makes sense. But I want to pause for a second and just ask if there are any questions or comments about this concept. Basically, as the facilitator, you are kind of playing what if about what's going to come back at you in the context of that conversation. You're going to think about all the possibilities. You're going to think about how those make you feel so that you're prepared if that's the emotion that hits you in the moment of the conversation.
Lynn, I haven't seen any questions or comments come in yet, so if I do, we can always circle back. Oh, wait,
Excellent.
here's one.
Yeah.
Here's one, sorry. This person said this is a great concept. Your term for it is very concrete and easy to understand.
Good. I'm glad. I was just about to say, so that was clear as mud, right? But apparently it was clearer than mud. So just to clarify, this isn't about trying to figure out what you're going to say or do in response to a reaction. It's really about what that feels like so that you aren't taken by surprise by it when that hits you in the moment, as a way to kind of maintain your own neutrality and stay emotionally uninvolved as a facilitator. So that's one thing. The other thing about remaining neutral that's difficult for us in our situation is keeping silent on content issues. Again, we may not have the luxury of bringing in someone else who has no vested interest whatsoever in the final outcome of whatever the content is that's being discussed. Most of the time, we are invested in it, and that's why we're bringing it up, or that's why we want to have a discussion about it. And it's often difficult to find someone who can really be neutral on that ground. So if you have a leadership role in the group that you're working with, it's important that you plan your activities very clearly, trust that they'll lead people in the direction that you're hoping that they'll want to go, but then be really clear about when you're wearing your facilitator hat and when in the hopefully very rare moments you need to take that hat off and put on your leadership hat and say, okay, I appreciate all the feedback that you're giving me. This is the executive decision that I'm making about this right here, right now, or this is why it happens like that, rather than kind of beating around the bush or supposing why something's happening the way that it is. Being really deliberate about saying, okay, I'm facilitating this conversation, I'm creating this safe space, I'm not kind of wiggling back and forth across the line. If I need to step in and say, okay, this is my contribution because I care about this content and I'm not neutral, I'm going to make it really clear that that's the case so that there isn't any question about when I'm being the facilitator and when I'm being the leader. Tough things. So staying neutral is tough. One other piece of advice is if you want to practice your facilitation skills and you want to practice them not with your own staff or coworkers, make friends with someone at a library near you who also wants to practice and trade. So you go facilitate that person's tough staff meeting and that person comes and facilitates your tough process analysis. That takes you out of the mix. You get practice in another setting. You share, because we're all about sharing in libraries. It's a strategy that I've used just once, really, but it worked fabulously, and I highly recommend making friends with someone else who can be your kind of pinch facilitator, who can come in without that vested interest in whatever it is that's going on. Okay, so back to our three things: activity-based, respectful of different modes of participation, directed but not directly persuasive. So you want activities that are going to guide people in the direction where you want them to head. If you're working through a chaotic situation where no one person is responsible for the whole thing, but a bunch of people are responsible for different parts, as an example, you can't just tell people, look, this is a mess and we need to figure it all out. It's a lot better to show that, or to have them do something that makes it abundantly clear firsthand. So whenever the old show don't tell adage from creative writing and lots of other things, like that's absolutely the name of the game when it comes to facilitation. Otherwise you could just have a lecture. And the reason that you want to have a conversation is usually because you want a different kind of an outcome than you would with a lecture. So those are kind of the high points, the things to keep in mind as you're thinking about your tough conversation and how you're going to approach it. So now I want to get into some specific ideas. The handout also has several citations for resources for getting ideas for facilitation activities. There are a couple there that are really outstanding and that are freely available online. And I highly recommend that you check them out. Some of my favorites are what we're going to talk about here, the things that have been especially successful for me in the past. First one, ground rules. One of our commenters kind of referenced this a little earlier on, that in the room there was agreement that if there was disagreement, that the facilitator would be the one to kind of broker the final decision. And that can be something that you build into your ground rules. The best case scenario for coming up with ground rules is that the group itself decides what those rules are going to be. This is most effective in a group that will be working together over some extended period of time. That can be a group that's working together on a specific project, and that's together as a project team or a task force, or it can be a group of coworkers that meet together regularly, a management team, for instance. Ground rules tend to take up a lot of time in just one-off discussion. And in that case, you can set the ground rules yourself and just go over them quickly at the beginning of the session. But the best case is that the room decides what the ground rules are going to be. Oftentimes, people get stuck in coming up with ground rules. My favorite sort of icebreaker ground rule is no eye rolling. So everybody knows exactly what that behavior looks like. It drives almost everybody crazy. It usually gets a laugh and gets people thinking about what behavior is acceptable in this room. When the group itself comes up with the ground rules, they're much more likely to self-police. So if there's something about, leaving your title at the door, for instance, and all of a sudden someone starts throwing their weight around, it's much more likely, if those ground rules have been created by the group and they're on a flip chart page and they're posted on the wall, for someone to stand up and say, hey, you're kind of throwing your weight around. We decided we were going to leave our titles at the door. And that has a lot more weight than if I, as a presenter, have to step in and chastise somebody. So anytime you can get your group to do that work for you, you're going to be in really good shape. Ground rules can be, as I said, posted on a flip chart. They can be put on an index card that everyone brings with them to the meeting and has sitting in front of them. Anything that you want to do to make them kind of visible and present in your discussions will help give them more power, those ground rules. And the examples that I talked about, the books that I talked about and other resources have great examples of ground rules setting places to start. Next thing. This one's called the power of the pen. In a tough conversation, it's important to document what's said. Often, a ground rule in a tough conversation or in a group is the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of rule, like, this is a safe space and we're going to share openly here and nothing is going to leave this room. Documenting doesn't change that, but it makes it really clear that everything that everyone has to say is important and that we want to be accurate about hearing people and understanding what they're saying. So flip charts work really well, as the picture here demonstrates. Another technique that I really like to use, because I write relatively slowly and I'm not the neatest on a flip chart, is to just have a blank word processing document and to project it on a screen. I can type pretty fast and I can fix things when I'm typing, so if I get something wrong, someone can correct me, I can make that correction really quickly. Everyone can see at the same time exactly what's being documented. I like that technique a lot. Oftentimes, it's helpful to have someone else doing the writing but they have to follow kind of the same rules that dictate the power of the pen. And that's all about being authentic to whatever it is the person is saying. So you can paraphrase, but you can't change the content or the tone of what the person said. You can't edit. This is a process of documentation, not of synthesis. And that's one of the ways to make sure that everyone feels like they've been heard and heard accurately, is when their own words are being documented and not interpreted or edited to make it, easier to write or what have you. So if you've got someone else who can do the writing for you, great. Just you want to make sure that you are clear with them at the beginning of the process what that job entails so that they follow those same guidelines. Making those notes available to everybody depends on what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve. But to be able to bring that back to a group in a further discussion and refer back to it and say, oh yeah, we talked about this and this person said this or we said this or whatever is a really useful thing to have. So that's documenting. Next technique, it's called stacking. This is a traffic management technique. When we're passionate about things, we want to share what we have to say, and a lot of times if we're concerned about getting out what we have to say, we're not really listening to what's going on around us in the room. So this is a way to help people participate as listeners as well as speakers in a really kind of robust discussion. And it's really easy. Basically, when things are starting to get chaotic, you say, okay, let's stack this up. I want you to raise your hand if you have something that you want to say on this subject or in this particular exercise. And raise your hands, and so I'm going to point to each of you. Jane, you're going to be number 1. Robert, you're number 2. Sarah, you're number 3. Number people down, make a quick note to yourself. What happens then is that if Robert knows that he's going to be number 2 to talk, he's much more likely to sit back and actually listen to what Jane has to say as the first person. Sometimes you might find that there's a kind of a sidebar that you need to take, and that's fine. You can say, I want to explore this for a second. We're going to come back to our order, so don't worry, Robert. We are going to get back to you, and then we're going to go in the same order that we said before. But it helps kind of lessen the stress for people. They know that they're going to get their day. They're going to get heard. So they're much more likely to be listening rather than planning how they're going to get a word in edgewise. It's a good one. Silence. Silence is surprisingly useful. And it's also really hard. Although I think it's maybe less hard for those of us who are introverts than in other kind of situations. Sometimes you'll kind of prompt a discussion, or you'll ask a question, or you'll throw out a topic to start for brainstorming, and you'll hit a lull. And our tendency is to want to fill in that lull with either prompts or suggestions, or to misinterpret that as being done. So silence, sitting with just complete silence to wait for people to get their thoughts together or to add something. Don't be afraid of it. Let silences sit there. Let it sit for at least 5 seconds, which can feel like an eternity when you're in the midst of a discussion, and then it all just kind of suddenly shuts down. It feels like a long time, but definitely resist the temptation to prompt or to fill in with comments. People will pick it back up, and in some cases the silence gives people a chance to sort of regroup and come at it a different way. Sometimes yes or no are not enough. And so you need gradients of agreement. I love this so much. This is a way to kind of take a quick poll in the room to see how far you are apart or how close together you are if you're trying to make a decision or trying to come to some consensus or a unanimous decision. This allows for a lot more shades of gray than just yes and no. You can use it as a way to kind of show visually where everybody is, so you can have people take a dot, a sticker dot, because we have tons of those in libraries, and just put a dot next to the thing that they feel, so that on a chart, so that everybody can see exactly where the room stands, and then kind of what direction you need to go in from there. This is from the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making, which is one of the resources that's at the end of this presentation. It's a really good one. That gets us to the concept of consensus. Consensus is often confused with unanimity, and they're not the same thing. Not everybody has to be 100% on the same thought track for there to be consensus. And this is a definition or a way of thinking about consensus that I really like a lot. Again, it's one that I often will print out or write on a flip chart page and post in a room if consensus is something that we're trying to get to, so that everybody can see and can remember what we're talking about. The first two are about understanding, and that comes through the process of discussion and some of the activities that we're going to touch on in just a bit. The third item there, this may not have been my first choice, but I can live with it. It's really important, really, really important. Again, we get passionate about stuff, and it's important to take a step back and realize that just because the final decision isn't the way that we would have wanted it to happen doesn't mean it isn't something that we can live with. It doesn't mean it isn't something that's good for us as staff members, that it isn't good for our customers. Oftentimes, being able to live with it is really a great accomplishment, to get a room full of people on that same page. And then the last one, I will support this decision because it was reached in an open and fair manner. I often will actually poll the room and say, okay, so here's kind of where we've landed as a group. This is the final spot where we are. Think about it in terms of consensus. Do you agree with all four of these statements? If you do, raise your hand. As a way to just see, do we actually have consensus in this room? So that's consensus. Next one. This one I use all the time, not just in facilitated discussions, but also in training sessions, and that's the parking lot. It's usually a flip chart page because, flip charts, they're great. And it's really just a place to set things aside that are off topic, but that are in a place where everyone can see them and know that they won't get lost or get kind of swept under the rug, or that we won't circle back and talk about them again. When those off-topic things come up, you can say, you know what, I want to keep us focused on this topic that we're talking about right now, but let's put that in the parking lot, and we'll make sure that we come back to it. It may not be today, it may be in another meeting in the future, but that way it won't get lost in the rest of the discussion that we're having. It's kind of amazing how great a job that does at alleviating people's concerns that you're not hearing what they're saying when things aren't completely relevant to the task at hand. There's a behavior that librarians are really good at, and that is to find every yeah but about something that can possibly be found, which is a really useful thing. It's great for contingency planning and figuring out how you're going to deal with every eventuality, but sometimes that can derail a discussion. This is a very effective way of saying, okay, we're going to take that and we're going to set it over here for now. It's acknowledged, it's not forgotten. We can come back to it, but we're going to stay focused on the task at hand. Love the parking lot. Next, I want to talk a little bit about baggage. We all have it, and we often have it as institutions and organizations. And a lot of times it can drive decisions in a way that we're not even aware of. A lot of times a tough conversation revolves around some baggage that people are dragging around with them that they don't even realize they're dragging around with them. And sometimes it takes unpacking that baggage and going through what's in it before you can really move forward with the rest of that conversation. So a couple of things about unpacking baggage. One is Peter Senji, the fifth discipline, he's the whole learning organization guy. his concept is about mental models, and a mental model is a framework or a set of beliefs that we use to make decisions and take action. They're usually unconscious assumptions, and they drive our decision making without us even understanding it. So one of the challenges is to actually describe what that mental model is in order to be able to shift it and get it to work for us in a different way. So for instance, actually, let me come back to this. There's a technique that I like as sort of a shortcut to unpacking baggage or figuring out what that mental model is or what the essence of that baggage is, and that's the 5 whys, and it's exactly the 5 whys. So let's say we're in a conversation, we're trying to come up with a solution, someone puts a solution out on the table, the reaction is, if we do it that way, we'll get in trouble. The response to that is, well, why? So maybe the first why, after that's asked, it's because we aren't supposed to do it that way. Well, why? Because so-and-so said we aren't supposed to do it that way. Okay, why? Maybe it was their personal preference. Okay, why? Maybe because they tried it a lot of different ways and they thought this was the best way. And why? Because maybe the circumstances were different when they made that decision. So we've gone through the 5 whys. If we do it that way, we get in trouble. What do we come up with? What does it tell you at the end of that? That maybe the decision to do it that way was made at a time when circumstances were different. Maybe we can try some other ways and come up with a better way for the circumstances that we're dealing with today. So just as an example, that's one way to sort of pick apart what the foundation belief or kind of the organizational culture, that unspoken stuff that drives what people do and what their reactions are, to get at the meat of that so that you can pull it apart and kind of deal with it. Another way to approach this, once you sort of get at the base assumption, is to start to flip that on its head. So as an example, let's see. So at a library that I've worked at in the past, there was a group of staff who felt like they couldn't bring problems to the administration because they would get slapped down for it. So talking about that, we kind of started to wonder whether there are any merits to a belief system that involves that. So we kind of talked through and did what's called itemized response. So we talked about what the benefits are of a belief system that says that you can't bring things to administration or you'll get smacked down for it. And then once we formulate all of those responses, then you start to say, okay, so what are the problems with that? What are the concerns and how can we fix them? So one of them maybe is that you don't get to hear the whole truth of what's going on, and so maybe we set up a way to provide that kind of feedback to administration in a way that won't be threatening. Or maybe we say, you know, maybe that's a belief that doesn't even exist anymore because the administration who smacked people down has been retired for 20 years. So let's start from scratch. What kind of system do we want to operate in? There's a bunch of stuff about organizational health and baggage. Another book to take a look at is The Advantage by Peter Lencioni, which is all about organizational health and how important it is. The idea is that organizational health is more important than business strategy or the bottom line in terms of business success. So lots of resources on that. Okay. A few more activities and techniques that you can use. One is brainwriting. So this is different from brainstorming because it includes writing, and it's a really great tool to have in your back pocket in a room full of people who may not be quick off the cuff speaking or who may have some safety issues about speaking up in a room full of people. It's a lot like brainstorming. You set out flip chart pages or on different easels or on tables, or you have everybody start with a single blank piece of paper and you pose your question or ask them to write down whatever it is. So for instance, why do we do programming in the public library? So you just walk around and write your ideas down on that piece of paper, or you sit and you write an idea down on the page in front of you, and after a minute we swap pages and you see what someone else has written and you can either tag on that or add another thing to that list. It's a way for people to build on each other. It gives people ample time to think and formulate what they want to say before they write it down. And then you can bring it all back together and debrief so that everyone can see all of the different ideas that were brought forward. It's a technique that I really like a lot, and especially in a room where you've got people who are shy or when you need really authentic input across an entire organizational structure. Another activity, hopes and fears. It's exactly what it sounds like. This one's especially helpful when starting a tough conversation where people have some trepidation about how it's all going to shake down. Is it going to be ugly? Is it going to end in tears and gnashing of teeth? This is a great place to start. So you really say, so what are your hopes for this particular process or about the subject that we're talking about? And you brainstorm them and you document them. Then after everyone's exhausted all of their hopes, then you ask them what fears they have about the process or about whatever the thing is that you're discussing. Couple different ways to kind of handle that input. You can have free form, just people raise their hand and throw something out. You can go around the table multiple times until everyone's out of ideas, where people can just pass if they're already out of ideas, but it kind of makes sure that everyone has a chance to respond. You can start with letting people write their thoughts down first and then to share them. Any of those kinds of brainstorming or idea generating activities will work in this case. The thing to keep an eye on is if the fears outweigh the hopes, or if you start to hear fears disguised as hopes. So when you say, okay, we're going to do hopes and fears, let's talk about hopes first. What are your hopes for this process? Instead of getting stuff like, I hope we develop better connections as a team, you might start to get stuff like, I hope that this just isn't just another useless exercise, right? That's not really a hope so much as a fear in disguise. So in that case, you can either challenge the participants to really think in terms of what the hoped for outcome is rather than what it is not, or you can jump right to what's the worst that can happen. I don't use this very often, but when I do, I try to get people to go to the nth degree. So in this process, what's the worst that can happen? Like really, what is the worst that can happen? We get into a fist fight. So what happens then? Somebody says something just completely inappropriate and we have to take disciplinary action. What happens then? I mean, what really literally is the worst that can happen in this process? As people start to brainstorm the kind of outlandish and crazy things that really constitute the worst thing, it puts things in perspective and it allows people to get back to hopes, which is really where you want people to be thinking. Next, the affinity process, also known as silent sorting. This is where you have people write their ideas down or you do your brainstorming on sticky notes or on index cards, and then you put them all in a pile and you make sure that everybody has some extra ones to use as headers, and then silently they have to put those items in some kind of order or group them together without talking to each other. It's a fascinating process and it allows for people who are not, again, verbally comfortable to really take an active role in what the group is doing. So again, for instance, let's say we're talking about programming and needing to rethink library programming, and you do a why do we do library programming, you might use this as a way to synthesize, you know, what are the main things, and ask the group to sort of do that silent sorting, or the affinity part of it is how do these things fit together, where are things like each other. This tends to work best in a group of 8 to 10 people or fewer. More than that, it just gets physically challenging because not everybody can be in the same space at the same time. But, you know, your mileage may vary. Okay. I think I've got one more. Yes, process mapping. Okay, so process mapping is really good when the issue at hand involves some level of complexity or a lack of clarity about who's responsible for what or how things got to be the way that they are. It works best when you have a larger group and you split them up into 2 or more groups and have them each tackle the same job separately. And what it's basically asking people to do is to map out all of the steps in the process that you're talking about, every single possible step that they can come up with, to figure out who's responsible for that step. It's often important to remind people in this kind of exercise that you're mapping the process as it exists right now, today, not as you want it to be or not the way we would want to fix it to be. That comes later, but what is the actual process that we're talking about? So this is something that can be really effective when you've got a cross-disciplinary or cross-departmental process and it's breaking down or it's confusing or it's not working, to get everybody involved in the same room and have them all kind of break that process apart, especially in more than one group, and then compare and see what pieces were missing and what weren't. This is one of the best techniques I know of for getting people to see for themselves when a really complex process might need some change or some attention. Because until they can see the whole thing, it's hard to kind of think about how that might be a useful activity for them. So that's my random smattering of facilitation activities and skills. They all kind of center on the things that we talked about, on making sure that it's an activity-based process, that the folks in the room are doing most of the work and you're just kind of directing traffic and guiding the discussion. They're all things that allow people to feel safe, that there's some structure in place that makes it so that they're going to be okay sharing their actual thoughts and feelings. And it allows you to direct a process without giving direct instructions to a specific outcome. So one more poll question. Do you feel like you know more about leading tough conversations now than you did an hour ago when we started?
I'm launching a poll, so everyone can go ahead and vote. Give it a few seconds. We've got about 50% have voted, so I'll give it a few more seconds. That's 65%, 70. All right. We can go ahead and close the poll and show the results.
Oh, good.
All right, Lynn. So 91% felt yes, they are more ready now, and 9% felt no. So,
okay.
And I know this is tough. So maybe we can watch the recording again later.
Yeah. Well, and I did really throw a whole, like I said, a smattering of techniques at you. What I was hoping to provide was both sort of the big picture overview of what the considerations are as well as some specific ideas. But we do definitely have time for questions. So if there's something that I didn't address that you want to know more about, now's your chance.
I have a question while we're waiting for the attendees to type them in. Can you give some examples of some scenarios that you have used these facilitation techniques? I mean, what were some of those tough conversations, if you can share that?
Absolutely. The one that jumps immediately to mind, some of you may have heard me talk about the craziness in Wisconsin back in 2011 when collective bargaining rules changed in the state, and at the Brown County Library where I was working at the time, most of our staff were under a union contract that was suddenly going to get pulled out from under the feet of those folks. So we put together a group to try to rewrite from scratch a new employee handbook, and that was a whole slew of tough conversations. There was a lot of sort of administration staff tension, there was some management labor tension there, there was some main library branch library tension, there was the whole like professional librarians are better than everybody else thing that sometimes kind of comes up in libraries. All of that tension could have been super ugly had it had the chance to just flare up and go nuts. Ground rules were really important in that particular situation. The other thing that was useful in that situation is that the group really had a product that we needed to come up with. So that helped drive the discussion forward in a way that allowed us not to get mired down in kind of emotional details. Another example, at another library we had a process so we had a floater who was available to spend time at branches filling in when someone was on vacation. And so that person reported to an administrative staff member, but actually worked practically in a bunch of branches for a bunch of different people who they didn't report to. And so the process for kind of booking that person's time and then also providing feedback on performance was crazy and out of control. So getting everybody together in the same room and kind of mapping it out made it clear that, yeah, there's reasons that we need a process for this, and it isn't as easy as just saying, well, I need this person today because you don't know what the other person had going on at their branch. So having that kind of a discussion to kind of, again, pick the pieces apart and figure it out, I think was really important. I will say the baggage thing often kind of creeps up on you. Like you may have a conversation about, oh, I don't know, a policy or a procedure, and you think it's really straightforward, and then all of a sudden someone will say something like, well, we can't do it that way. And you kind of dig at that a little bit and figure out that the reason that we can't do it that way is literally because someone who retired 20 years ago once said, we can't do it that way. And that's crazy, crazy stuff. Another one that's come up in several different places where I've worked is to characterize the culture of the organization or of the management or administration based on an old version of it. So in another library, there was a prior director who liked to pit one branch against another and like say, well, this branch had better circ this month than your branch did, which is kind of crappy, whatever. But people held on to that even though that administration had completely turned over and we weren't thinking in that term at all anymore, but that kind of baggage came with them.
I haven't seen any questions come in yet, so I'm going to put just one more, shout out that if you have questions, we've got time. I have another question for you, Lynn.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, do you have any suggestions? These facilitation techniques are great, and I can see how they can keep a conversation on track. But what do you suggest if the conversation gets off track, or you've just maybe hit a brick wall and do you have,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? How do you bring the conversation back to the task at hand?
Yeah, there are a couple different versions of that. One is it gets off track because maybe it often happens because somebody has an agenda and they really want to push forward that agenda and just won't let it go. And in that case, a lot of times I'll take a break, like take 5, and maybe take that person aside and say, the goal of this conversation was to talk about this thing, and I know that you're really passionate about this other thing. Let's maybe set up a time that we can talk about that other thing, but right now we really need to focus on this. It's a place where you can also enlist people in falling back on the ground rules. So to say, if one of your ground rules is don't monopolize the discussion, you can say, I feel like we're kind of tipping into one of our ground rules here, so I'd ask you to do that just to be respectful of everybody else in the room. The other thing I would say is that it's okay to just stop. Like you can say, I think that we've kind of hit a tough spot here, so let's just call it a day for this discussion. We're going to take some time to think about what we've talked about, and we'll come back in another week or 2 weeks and we'll start again. And in the meantime, I'll send out all of the documentation of what we talked about and maybe throw out a couple questions for you to be thinking about ahead of time so that you're not walking into the room cold. That cooling off period can often be really useful, and it's no failure to say, okay, we need to take a breather here and step away from this for a while, and then we can come back and get back on track.
Some great tips. All right, well, I haven't seen any other questions or comments come in, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
It's always nice to finish up a little early, so thank you so much, Lynn, for your time today and presenting on this topic. I also thank you for recording, and just so everyone out there knows, we did record, and Lynn, graciously offered to share her slides, and I'll be posting all of that on the Rails website, and I will email everybody when those are ready. It should be by the end of the week.
Excellent.
So thank you so much, Lynn.
My pleasure.
All right.
Have a great rest of your day.
You too, and thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. So bye everybody, have a good afternoon.
Thanks.